Next week marks 1 year since a slate of new abortion restrictions became law in North Carolina. Tonight, we examine how the law is playing out in clinics and affecting families statewide. A leader with Planned Parenthood describes the legal tightrope doctors walk to comply. Then the short session at the state legislature has begun. The topics expected to dominate this session and the leadership shift lingering over the General Assembly. Plus, we are days away from a runoff election. The plot twist in the 13th district, new polling, and what it all could signal for the general election. WRAL's NC Capitol chief and a state politics expert are here to break it all down.
It's time to go on the record with WRAL News.
Good evening and thanks so much for joining us for On the Record. I'm Lena Tillett. Next week marks 1 year since the most restrictive abortion legislation in decades became law in North Carolina. The most talked about restriction in the law bans abortions after the 12th week of pregnancy, with 3 exceptions. More on that in a minute. Reproductive rights advocates tell WRAL other restrictions in the law have been nearly as disruptive to women seeking abortions. For instance, the law requires a total of 2 in-person visits. Patients have to make 2 separate trips to a clinic at least 72 hours apart before getting an abortion on the second visit. For working women, women who are already mothers, or lower income women, experts say this makes getting an abortion drastically more difficult, which for state Republican lawmakers was the point. Let's talk about the exceptions to the 12-week limit. There are 3 in cases of rape or incest, for, quote, life-limiting fetal anomalies, and also to save the life of the mother. I wanted to know how the restrictions and these exceptions are playing out in real life. And joining us now to discuss is Susanna Birdsong, General Counsel and Vice President of Compliance for Planned Parenthood South Atlantic. Susanna, thank you so much for joining us. So the law officially took effect in the summer, so that means you all have been following it now for nearly a year. What's been the most cumbersome restriction so far for women that you've seen?
Well, I mean, as you just noted, the 12-week ban piece is huge. That is a huge restriction on access to care. The law in North Carolina prior to the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, was that abortion was legal after 20 weeks of pregnancy. And so going to 12 weeks means that several weeks of access has been cut off. And when you think about what that means for somebody who has irregular periods, who isn't tracking their periods, who doesn't know that they're pregnant right away, it really limits the window of time that somebody has to make a decision, make an informed decision, and make a healthcare decision that's right for them.
I recently talked to a clinician who described the 2 in-person visits in that 72-hour wait as so challenging, particularly for working women. What types of women are you seeing most impacted by these restrictions at this point?
All abortion restrictions have a disparate impact on people who are low income, on people who live in more rural areas, on people who have less flexibility in their lives. So they're working, sometimes they're working 2 or 3 jobs, sometimes they're working second shift, and it is hard to, and they have less reliable transportation. It can be hard to just get to the clinic. And so any abortion restriction has a disparate impact on that population. And the 2-trip requirement, the requirement that somebody needs to come to a clinic, do their state mandated consent, wait 72 hours, and then come back to the clinic for their abortion, has a disparate impact on on those populations of people.
Let's talk about the exceptions to the 12-week limit. What is the process for reporting an exception to the state? Because that has to be reported to the state, correct?
Yes, all abortions have to be reported to the state on state forms. And if you are providing an abortion under one of the exceptions after the 12th week of pregnancy, so in cases of rape, incest, fetal anomaly, or to save the life of the pregnant person, there is additional reporting that has to happen, including sending an ultrasound image to the state for statistical purposes.
So all of these abortions are being recorded, collected by the state?
Yes.
Women are being told about this, I'm sure, as they're getting an abortion. What's been the reaction?
Yes. I mean, all of the information that we are sending in is de-identified, but it is a lot of information. It takes into account demographics, it takes into account where the person is from, how many prior pregnancies they've had, what the outcome of the abortion was, if there were complications from the abortion, who the physician is. There's a lot of information that gets reported to the state for every abortion that occurs in North Carolina.
Let's talk about the exception, say if the life of the mother is in danger. How is that being determined? Is a doctor saying that and then providing a description of how much the mother's life is in danger? Can you explain how that works?
Yep. The medical emergency exception in the law says that an abortion can be provided at any stage of pregnancy to save the life of the pregnant person if there is and medical emergency is defined as substantial and irreversible harm to a major bodily function. And so that is not a medical term necessarily, and so it is up to the doctor and in most, if not all cases, their lawyers to determine if somebody's health condition has reached the point where it is both substantial and irreversible, and is at the point where it would be irreversible if not corrected, and it's going to impact a major bodily function.
Okay, so let's talk about Texas, for instance, because we saw one case that really drew national headlines where a doctor said that the baby's life was at risk. The baby had a fetal anomaly and said that the mother should get an abortion. The state courts said that she did not qualify for a state exception. Has that happened? Has anything like that happened in North Carolina?
We've not seen that happen in North Carolina, and I will note that the language and the laws are very similar around that medical emergency exception. That is the only exception in Texas's abortion ban, is in cases of medical emergency, and the language is very similar to the North Carolina language, substantial and irreversible harm to a major bodily function. And the difference, I think, in Texas and North Carolina, in large part, is not the language in the law, but the enforcement regime. And the fact that in Texas you have virulently anti-abortion governor, attorney general, and other enforcers of the law who are saying this is to be interpreted narrowly and are threatening hospitals and doctors with legal action, including criminal and civil penalties and licensing sanctions if they provide an abortion outside what those enforcers determine is appropriate. And so in the case of Kate Cox in Texas last year, you had a judge say to her and her lawyers, yes, we think your case meets the exception within the law. And you had the enforcers immediately come in and send letters to the hospital, send letters to the doctor to say, if you perform this abortion, we will prosecute you. And we don't have that enforcement regime in North Carolina right now. And I think that is a big difference because the language of the law is substantially similar. And elections have consequences. And so we're thinking about what it would be like to have an enforcement regime in North Carolina one day like they have in Texas.
So let's talk about that, because state Republicans have called their new abortion law generally moderate, saying in much of the Southeast, I mean, there's a 6-week ban. How do you respond to that? They don't have enforcement in North Carolina. Is it more moderate here in this state?
We do have civil and criminal penalties in the North Carolina abortion ban. And so I just want to be clear that doctors, other practitioners who are engaged in assisting with abortion care can be criminally prosecuted, held civilly liable for providing abortions outside the confines of the law. It's just that we don't have the tenor is different right now in North Carolina as opposed to Texas, where you have enforcers who are proactively sending letters to hospitals saying, don't you dare.
Are providers nervous about legal consequences in this state?
Of course. Yeah, of course. Anytime there is a restriction in the law that impacts healthcare decision-making that should be happening between a doctor, their patient's family, anytime the legislature injects itself into that exam room, there is going to be a chilling effect on that conversation, on the healthcare that can happen there, and on doctors' willingness and ability to provide that healthcare.
Susanna, thank you so much for your time and your insight. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Still to come, the short session at the state legislature has begun. Some topics already seem to be dominating. We look at the issues with our political experts after the break. After several relatively quiet months in the state capitol, lawmakers are back in Raleigh to begin what's called the short session. This is a time when legislators will make adjustments to the state budget. While an election year can be a time when the short session sees less controversial legislation move through, it's unclear what the tenor will be in the days ahead. And joining us to discuss is our NC Capitol Bureau Chief, Laura Leslie, and Meredith College political science professor David McLennan. So great to see you both in person. Laura, so I want to start with the funding priorities for Republicans, beginning with private school vouchers, because that really does seem to be a priority. How did that become a priority for state Republicans?
What happened is last year they removed the income tax. There used to be an income cap on how much you could earn in order to get a voucher, and they basically took that off last year. So that kind of blew demand out of the water. That and the fact that they also made it possible for you to get a voucher if you were already attending private school. So a lot of private school parents have put in for vouchers to help to offset the cost, obviously. So they ended up with a waiting list for this program of more than 50,000 families. So they said, well, obviously we need to expand the funding for next year so we can cover all these families on the waiting list. And so that's how that came up pretty quickly, but both the House and Senate seem to be agreed on it.
Yeah, the state Senate has already okayed $500 million, roughly.
Give or take, yeah, that's about right.
David, what are the politics around this issue? I'd imagine, I mean, this is taxpayer dollars potentially going to wealthy families who could already afford to send their children to private schools. But this appears to also be popular. What's the politics here?
It's a complex issue because not only are the public schools a top priority for voters in the state, but they also like this idea of parental choice. And so, you know, it kind of depends on who you're talking to. Obviously, people who support the public schools see this as taking away from paying teachers in the public schools and the other priorities. But if you look at parents, they say, you know, I want the choice to put my child into a better school than my base school, for example. So it really cuts both ways. You'll hear a lot of Democrats campaigning against this on the campaign trail this fall, but not all of them.
I think one thing to mention, though, and we hear a lot from state lawmakers, Republican leadership, that they're not planning to cut the funding for public schools, they say, so that argument is void. But they forget to mention something really important, which is that a lot of the funding for schools comes per pupil, right? So when you have fewer pupils going to a public school, you have less money and less ability for that school to use the economies of scale that they do to try to get those extra teachers for those supplemental subjects that parents like, your art, your music, and your basic needs that schools have to meet every day.
You could tell that Governor Cooper was signaling that he thought this was going to be a priority for state Republicans this year as well. I mean, he called it at the beginning of the year, this is the year of public schools. He talks about this all the time and the need for funding. I mean, obviously, this is his final year as governor, but do you think that this is something he should be focused on?
I think it's been his focus his entire 2 terms in the governorship. So what he's doing is providing some cover for candidates, Democratic candidates. He's going out hard. He talked about an 8% increase in the budget adjustment, which is unlikely. But, you know, he is going as hard as he can because he wants people to focus in on the idea, as Laura mentioned, that it may not be directly taking from school budgets, but indirectly because of the per pupil funding, it is taking away from school budgets.
Laura, let's talk about something else moving quickly through the legislature. The Shalom Act, in direct response to the protests, the pro-Palestinian protests on UNC's campus and other campuses. What does this law do?
Well, that depends who you ask, of course, as is often the case. But this bill came up fairly quickly, and it was mostly, as you say, as leaders told us, in response to some of the protests that they've seen at UNC and other schools. They're talking about people chanting things like death to Jews, death to Israel. They say that's beyond the pale, right? That's not political speech at that point. That's hate speech. So what they want to do, or what they're in the middle of doing, is they're adding to the law this new definition of anti-Semitism that was created by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And the IHRA said it wasn't meant to be used legally. It was meant to be used as a tool, educational tool. But a lot of states have actually adopted it as their definition, working definitions in law. Now, there's no actual penalties in the bill, right? But what it does is it puts this into law, which is the first time we've ever had a definition of anti-Semitism in state law. And it would be helpful to courts in order to prosecute people for anti-Semitic hate crimes.
David, we saw I just did a whole segment about the new abortion law. We saw such controversial and frankly consequential legislation moved through the legislature last year. It was the most acrimonious I had ever seen it. I've been here nearly a decade now. How do you read the mood this session and this year?
I don't think that acrimony has died out at all, because you're seeing a lot of things in the General Assembly, not only the Shalom bill, but also the anti-mask, as a reaction to the protests. I mean, the things that are going on college campuses have caused such a reaction, not only in North Carolina, but nationally. So we're seeing an attack on the university system in North Carolina. We're seeing, legislators talk about things that in a normal, typical short session, they might have just held off until the long session. But I think we're seeing a much more active short session because of things going on in North Carolina and nationally.
And obviously, we've seen local politics be nationalized so much.
Sure.
House Speaker Tim Moore, this is his last year likely as Speaker. How do you read his energy and enthusiasm this year?
To be honest, he feels like he's already sort of like on the campaign trail. He's already won the Republican primary for his seat, and because that's a safe Republican district, the odds are very, very high that his trip to Congress is pretty much assured. But what we are seeing is some more of these nationalized bills. For example, the Shalom Act, which was very close to legislation that was passed by the U.S. House a couple weeks ago. Also, there's the discussions that he's brought up about the border and about sending North Carolina National Guard troops down to Texas to help them shore up their border, which is something the governor has not yet done, and that would be up to the governor to do. So there's been a big push from him, a turn toward these national issues that I think is more pronounced than other years.
And we're seeing the sheriff's bill back up, where
Right.
they are going to require local sheriffs to comply with federal immigration officials.
Right, and that one I think will get a House vote next week, I think. And that's another one that they've passed twice already. If this sounds familiar, there's a reason. The governor has vetoed it both times, but now the Republicans have a supermajority in both chambers, so that makes them capable of overriding the veto.
Briefly, what do you think Speaker Moore's legacy will be?
Oh, I think he'll have a strong legacy of really conservative legislation. I mean, if you go back to his beginning of his tenure as Speaker, I mean, you can just tick off the consequential bills. I mean, just funding, reducing taxes. I mean, he has enacted the conservative agenda.
All right. New polling is showing a tightening presidential race and a widening governor's race. What that tells us ahead of a summer of campaigning. That's next. Welcome back. Let's shift our focus to the state's second primary election, just days away at this point. Election day is Tuesday, May 14th for the runoff races. All three are Republican primaries for lieutenant governor, state auditor, and the 13th congressional district. Except there's a plot twist with that last race. Kelly Daughtry dropped out of the race, endorsing her opponent, Brad Knott, after we saw so many commercials where they were very, very critical of one another. But it comes after former President Trump endorsed Brad Knott. Laura, was that the deciding factor in your opinion?
Well, let's put it this way. The president endorsed Brad Knott several weeks before Ms. Daughtry dropped out. So if it was a reaction, it was a delayed reaction. It's more likely that it was polling, perhaps, or money, perhaps, too, because money follows endorsements, after all. But it was very unusual, though. You just don't see candidates dropping out before, once early voting has started, which it already had. Because you can't take your name off the ballot. And so that's why Brad Knott is continuing to run ads, because there's still a possibility that voters could show up at the ballot box and vote for Ms. Daughtry, even though she has already said that she's not running anymore.
I found it interesting, David, too, because there's so much money that goes into those ads. You would think you would at least just finish the race.
Well, I think she was thinking down the road a little bit. What's her future going to be? I mean, she already ran in 2022 and finished third or fourth in the primary, and then in this election, she might want an appointment in a governor or a presidential administration, or might want to run again. So I think this just sort of paves the way for her. It is unusual because she spent millions of dollars between the two elections, but I think Laura's right in that the Trump endorsement may have kicked off some polling that showed that Knott's lead was insurmountable.
All right, let's talk about the state auditors and the lieutenant governor's race. Should we be paying attention to this race? How significant is it?
I think you can make the argument about lieutenant governor's race that Well, I think you should be paying attention to both of them. Number one, you're paying them, right? We're their bosses. Lieutenant governor is sometimes used as a stepping stone to get to the governorship, although that is rarely a successful stepping stone. More often than not, it's not successful. The auditor is that's the person who makes sure that state government is using your money wisely, and they're in charge of going through departments and making sure that things are being done right. So obviously you want to get somebody who's doing that, who's going to be really good at it.
All right, let's take a look at the latest Meredith College poll, beginning with the presidential race, because I think this is interesting. So it appears to show that Trump's lead over Biden is narrowing a bit. That also includes other candidates, though. You see Robert F. Kennedy Jr. there with 15% of the vote with unaffiliated voters. This is specifically with unaffiliated voters, but regardless, this is tightening. What's happening here?
Well, I think Robert F. Kennedy, his placement on the ballot, which we anticipate is going to be happening, is sort of shaking things up a bit. I mean, Biden has been behind Trump for the last year, and then Robert F. Kennedy got on the ballot, and I think they're seeing him as an alternative. But we also know how tight this is going to be. I mean, we go back to 2008, very close elections. So nobody anticipated a blowout either direction.
Let's talk about the governor's race, though, because the opposite trend is happening there. Josh Stein's lead over Mark Robinson has widened, which is significant. What do you make of that, Laura?
I think it's early days yet. I think for polling, I think a lot of people aren't really paying attention to this race yet. But I do think that it's possible that some of the primary advertising that was negative against Mr. Robinson by his primary opponents may have cost him some public opinion.
Obviously, unaffiliated voters, that's going to be the focus for the general election. What does Mark Robinson need to do to bring them on his side, in your opinion, David?
Well, I think you've seen him do some of the things already. He said he doesn't want to talk about abortion, where he has made some very strong statements. He's trying to come across as more gubernatorial, if you will. I think the real question, as Laura gets to, is in the fall when you'll see the Stein campaign run the ads reminding voters of all of his statements and actions, whether that really gets some traction with those unaffiliated or swing voters.
Is this typical? It seems like they're not campaigning, or at least they're not campaigning very loudly right now, Stein and Robinson. Is this just a down period? Do they not want attention right now until the fall? What do you make of that?
They're campaigning. They're out there. They're shaking hands and taking checks.
Sure.
Right.
But they're quietly doing
Yeah,
it.
they're not running ads right now, because that right now is just not the time that most people are paying attention to these races. That really gets going after Labor Day. Right. But you can even make the argument for August going into it. But in terms of, running ads statewide, you're probably not going to see too many more, which may make some people happy, I'm sure, for a few weeks after May 14th.
Laura Leslie, David McLennan, thank you so much for your insight. I really, really appreciate it. If you have something to say about tonight's discussion, you can find us on social media, or you can email us on the record at WRAL.com. Have a great evening.